Good evening, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and tonight it's Friday night, and we are once again joined by Richard Black of the Schiller Institute. More specifically, he is the representative of the Schiller Institute to the United Nations and has held that position for some time. Puts him on the inside of a lot of initiatives that are very, very interesting, and that coupled with his long study of our economic and political situation makes him quite an expert, and that makes it a real honor and pleasure to welcome Richard Black back to the show. Hello, Richard.
Hi, thanks so much, John.
Well, thank you. And well, let's start with some what I consider to be pretty good news, or at least a good report card from the efforts of the Schiller Institute to turn around the Green New Deal. So let's start there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of motion, and it's going on all over the world. I mean, for your listeners who may or may not be familiar, this Green Deal plan would basically shut down industry and agriculture up here in the advanced sector in the north, and doom the southern hemisphere, the former colonies, to never develop. And their plans, one of them is more ludicrous and absurd than the next. In Europe, the European Union just came out with a plan called Fit by 55. And they're talking about reducing emissions by 55% by the year 2030, including, get this, banning cars, gasoline cars, by 2035. It would be illegal to have a gas or diesel car by 2035. Here in the U.S., Biden signed an executive order when he first came in, endorsing the attack on our farmers, our family farmers, called 30 by 30, which says that we're going to take 30% of land out of any production, agriculture, industry, development, by the year 2030. This is going back to the Stone Age. So the plans of this Green New Deal basically amount to pauperization in the North and genocide against the impoverished section of the world in the South. So there is a rebellion, and I'll give you a bit of a tour around the world. In China, their answer is they say we need a lot more energy and we're going to build like mad. They have 49 nuclear power plants working now. They're building currently 16 internally, and they're constructing 10 nuclear power plants around the world, especially in Southeast Asia, energy poor areas. In Russia, they're gearing up coal production. President Putin gave a speech, I think I mentioned this before, a number of weeks ago, and he said, well, look, we produce 400 million tons of coal per year. Half of it we export, and we're going to expand. The world needs energy. So they're upgrading their big rail lines, their Trans-Siberian Railroad, and another east-west link to be able to more efficiently produce and export coal. So that's their answer to the UN's global depopulation plan and plan for shutting down energy. In India, I found this quite remarkable. When John Kerry came huffing and puffing into India to tell Modi, the prime minister, well, you better shut down coal, shut down energy, he was told by the foreign minister, whatever happens at the big climate summit come November, we're not signing on. You can't count on us. And the energy minister of India was quite passionate. He spoke at a roundtable discussion, and when he was pressed about India, remember, 1.3 billion people now, shutting down their energy capacity, he talked about the world as a whole. His name is Mr. Singh. He's the energy and power minister. He said, look, we have 800 million African people who don't have access at all to electricity. Africa will need more steel, We'll need more and more cement, more and more plastics. All of that's made with carbon. You have to give space for these countries to develop. And it was quite something. He was pounding his fist on the table, and the British moderator was getting all flustered and tried to cut him off. He would not be cut off. Now, this is India. This is not some small country someplace. 1.3 billion people, Indian, a civilization that's 5,000 years old, a proud nation that rebelled against the British Empire, got their independence under an intellectual giant, Gandhi. So when you have India fighting on the world stage in this fashion, this is quite important. In the U.S., here in America, in the Midwest, Nebraska, Iowa, up and down to Texas, there are town meetings being held, angry town meetings of farmers and ranchers against the 30 by 30 plan. In Nebraska, the governor is leading the fight. There are activists who are moving from town to town, state to state, organizing meetings, and the farm sector is basically up in arms against the Green New Deal. In Europe, there's a group of, I guess it's about 900 to 1,000 physicists, scientists, climate experts, who they're part of a group called, it's called the Global Climate Intelligence Group, or CLINTEL. You see this here. So they've signed a declaration, and they're organizing against this plan to use CO2 emissions as an excuse to shut down industry and agriculture. And basically, these scientists are saying the science on climate is not settled. And in fact, CO2, as it's declared to be a threat by the computer models, is false. The science is false. The models are false. We're being sold a fraud. In Europe, in placid, passive Europe, in Switzerland, about a month and a half ago, there was a popular referendum for everybody to vote on 3 issues on running an economy based upon limiting CO2 emissions, and all 3 referenda failed. The population said hell no. And when they did a demographics of who voted, it was the young people who said, we're not going along with this crap. So I could go on, but that gives you a sense from Nebraska to India to Switzerland to Africa to Russia to China. There is a momentum that we are ready for a fight, and the fight's going to begin in September. The UN is running 3 zero population growth conferences, one in early September on food in New York, one in early October in China on so-called biodiversity, and then the biggie is going to be in Glasgow, Scotland, the first 2 weeks of November. That's the next, they call it COP, Committee of the Conference of the Parties 26. That's the big climate summit of the year, and that's the showdown time. So that gives you a bit of a sense of it, I hope.
Well, thank you. And it kind of makes me wonder about the intelligence of this group wanting to have their big meeting in Glasgow in November. But I mean, I guess.
And Scotland.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's cold and rainy and nasty in November in Scotland. But
maybe this will trigger Scottish independence. Who knows?
Yeah. Well. Anyway, my effort at humor aside, I appreciate your tour there of the situation in various places around the world. You mentioned the CO2. Well, let's start with climate change, and then the next subject is CO2. And that reminds me of, I was talking last week with Mike Billington about this carbon stuff. And I suggested that it looks to me like, and this goes back to Al Gore and all of his efforts, to build up a carbon credit system in which people would trade carbon credits, and that seems to be still a very much of an idea that they're still pushing, and that is dependent upon people believing that CO2 is causing climate change and that we're causing the CO2.
Hmm.
And if they don't believe that, then this house of cards called carbon credits starts to look kind of empty and worthless. So, but is so my question to you is the carbon credit system that has been proposed, and you remember Al Gore with his movie and the hockey stick graph and all that. He was talking
Hmm.
about carbon credits back then and building, a big stable of young people to try to push this idea. Well, now we are at a kind of a crossroads, and if that was how they're going to do the financing by creating these pieces of paper called carbon credits, or digital currency called carbon credits, and financing through that, using that to borrow against and create more of these derivatives and debts instruments, you're attacking really the foundation of their hopes and dreams to extend this bankrupt financial system of into the next 20 or 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. Um, Tell me how you see the issue of whether these carbon credits are going to have value, and what happens if people decide they don't have value.
Yeah, I think your analysis is essentially correct. But from my standpoint, what this whole carbon trading, credits are about is a form of genocide against the former colonial sector. And an example that occurred over the last 2 weeks is there was an agreement signed between the West African nation of Gabon with Norway, and Norway agreed to give $100 million to the nation of Gabon if Gabon agreed to, and they would be purchasing from Gabon carbon certificates because Gabon is almost all forestry. So they absorb a lot of CO2, supposedly. So Gabon had to sign papers pledging not to industrialize, not to have modern rates of electricity, modern sanitation, modern cities for a mere $100 million over maybe a 10-year period. And so Norway, by purchasing these credits, is allowed to produce more carbon, and a pittance of money is given to Gabon, and there they sign away the lives of their children and grandchildren to live forever in poverty. That's the social aspect of this carbon credits. And of course, it's a complete bubble. Uh, Credit, as defined by the American founding fathers, by Alexander Hamilton, as understood by John Quincy Adams, Friedrich List, Henry C. Carey, credit is something extended by the state in order to put the wheels of production in motion over a production cycle, which might be a year, it might be 5 years, it might be 20 years. And by the extension of that credit, it allows the minds of the men and women who are the workforce and the designers and the labor of the workforce to produce new value in an economy, whether that be agriculture or industry or machinery or invention. And that then those debts are extinguished by the added profit added to the economy as a whole by that human activity. That's the human and American definition of credit. And all of this, as you described, all this derivative style trading on agreements to kill is a pure fantasy and is another bubble. And I can tell you from my discussions with African ambassadors at the UN, they know what this is about by and large. The problem is the countries in Africa are desperate. Most of them don't have 1% of their population vaccinated. So some of them are prone to make agreements out of absolute horrific desperation. But when you talk to the leadership, like the leadership of one of the main groups, the Group of 77, it's called, they are clear that this is a fraud and a hoax, and they better watch out.
Yeah, it's just my personal reading has taken me for the first time into an amazingly telling book written by a man named Gerard Colby and Charlotte Dennett, and it's called Thy Will Be Done. And it is a history of the combination of the Rockefeller family, starting with J.D. Jr. and the fundamental Bible thumping preacher business that was run as a business called Wycliffe Bible, and this person by the name of Frederick T. Gates, another Gates to be interested in. I don't think he's directly related, but he's a very important guy, because he is the guy that advised John D. Rockefeller Jr. as to how to set up what are called the philanthropies or foundations. And the story, I mean, the first 20 pages that I've read is just horrendous about what they've done in South America and in the American Southwest to they'll set up an Indian reservation on a place where they know that there are assets that they want to mine, whether it's silver or copper or whatever. And then they will use their ability to control the government through the Bureau of Indian Affairs to lease all this, and that's been going on for since the 50s. That this extreme exploitation by our Rockefellers and the related banking families and all of that stuff that we talk about so often. I mean, what they've done in South America is just breathtakingly chilling. And why wouldn't they do it to us? The method is the same. It's pretty much what you're talking about under this climate credit system in Africa. They did it without a formal declaration of here's some pieces of paper. They just took it, and genocide. You talk about genocide. That story has not been told in the way that it must be for people to understand the seriousness of these banking mentalities that will just use any means necessary to get the resources they want, including genocide.
The there's a more hideous aspect of this policy, which is, as I'm sure you're familiar, the designers of these policies, their view is that the world has too many people, especially too many people with dark skin.
Yep.
And typified by this in terms of practice was a document written at the National Security Council in 1974. Perhaps some of your other guests have mentioned this, called National Security Study Memorandum 200, written by Kissinger. And in this document, NSSM 200, again, 1974, Kissinger outlines that we must spread population control, birth control, famine, and disease in Africa. Because if African nations were allowed to develop modern economies, well, then they would use their natural resources for domestic advantage and prosperity, and wouldn't sell them at rigged, dirt cheap prices to us in the North. So it is in our national security interest. It becomes a military policy to foment wars, famine, depopulation, and birth control in the former colonial sector, which in a prior period had been raped by the Belgians, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, etc. And this became American policy. So when we look at the Green New Deal today, the ideology behind it is the world has too many people, we're using too much energy, and ultimately reduce population through famine, war, disease, for the historians among your listeners, they will recognize the policies of the British East India Company and Thomas Malthus, um, which really was the policy of the entire colonial genocide of the 18th and 19th century.
So how do you see it working if we continue to be successful in exposing and opposing this Green New Deal? Financially, you know, people, the elites and those who enforce for the elites are not going to be happy. Um, we need a whole lot more popular support for your movement. We need a whole
Absolutely.
nor education of people as to the real history of this country and what we're facing today may be the last chance, we remind ourselves from Lincoln that we are, the last best hope of mankind. I think that's true. Uh, I don't know of any other hope. So we, but how can we wake people up when they're so easily lulled to sleep by a Greta Thunberg and all that?
Well, see, it's interesting because I think they are less lulled to sleep than it appears. Take the Swiss vote. Switzerland is a relatively prosperous nation, a highly educated nation. Uh, the Green New Deal was attempted to be rammed down the throats of the people there, and they rejected it. Not once, not twice, but three times. And the population, was the most aware, were the youth. Now, in terms of organizing the forces here, you're absolutely right. We are growing. We're recruiting young people. People who are 18, 19, 20 years old to do the kind of work that Mike Billington and I and Marsha Maluk and others are involved in, Harley Schlanger. But we are having a very important conference. Maybe Andy can put it up. This is going to be a week from Saturday on the 24th. And people can tune in at schillerinstitute.com. The title of the conference, there it is. There is no climate emergency. Apply the science and economics of development to stop blackouts and death.
Perfect.
So,
Perfect. That's an excellent title. I think that's going to be very attractive.
yeah, and the first panel in the morning, starting at 9, will be an array of international scientists talking about the fraud of the use of this emissions argument to deindustrialize and depopulate. And in the afternoon will be a very beautiful picture of a series of urgent, great projects that immediately have to be pulled into action. Great construction projects, infrastructure projects, water, power, rail, land development, innovation cities, science cities around the globe. It's interesting. For all the weaknesses of Biden, and my God, it's hard to imagine how he could be much weaker. When he came in, uh, he immediately saw to it that the new SALT treaty of arms limitation with Russia was signed. He did meet with President Putin, and to almost everybody's surprise, they concluded their meeting with a joint communique quoting Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev from their mid-'80s summit that nuclear war is unwinnable, it must never be fought, and it can never be won. And he said, I can see myself soon meeting with President Xi of China. So the apocalyptic nature, John, of what you described is being understood by certain among the elites. Circles around Sam Nunn and former Deputy Prime Minister Ivanov and others. There are certain lines of communication between veteran U.S. policymakers and Russians, Chinese, which are saying we better pull back from a war with China over Taiwan. We better pull back from a war with Russia in the Black Sea over Ukraine. And there is a certain different kind of discussion going on. Mention Afghanistan, we can get more into that in a moment. Over the last week, many of the top Asian nations have been meeting nonstop about what do we do to prevent Afghanistan to descend into civil war with the U.S. Withdrawal. And the foreign minister of China said to all the other nations, Russia, India, the Central Asian nations, he said, look, let's make an appeal to the United States. We need you with us in rebuilding war-torn Afghanistan. Can we use our influence? Can each of you use your influence so that U.S. can work with us in rebuilding Afghanistan? There's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the dark green nations. They've been meeting all week this week. And so China, supposedly our big bad enemy, said to the colleague nations, can we bring the United States in and work together in rebuilding Afghanistan, which today produces 80% of the world's opium? The deaths on the streets of suburbs all over America coming from Afghanistan. Well, in the same week that Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, said, can we figure out a way to bring the United States in to this important project? At the State Department spokesman was asked by one of the reporters about whether we can trust China on the Afghanistan question. And the spokesman said as follows, well, I think this is an area where our interest, China and the United States, where they find some area of agreement and can work together constructively. The ability to do that would certainly not be only in our national interest, but also the collective interest as well. Now, this is from Ned Price, State Department spokesman, usually a fire-breathing anti-China hater. So in the same week, you have the top diplomat of China and the US State Department saying, maybe there's a way we can deal with this terrifying problem of spreading civil war, terrorism, chaos, separatism, Islamic fundamentalism, and drugs by the US and China working together. Can it be? That's the question. The head of our movement, a brilliant scholar and thinker, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, has for a long time been saying that the interests of the United States, Russia, China, seen from above, looked at from the highest standpoint, can be proven to be identical, that there's one single interest. Or as Edward Teller, the science advisor, physicist and science advisor to Ronald Reagan, said, we have to proceed in dealing with the Soviet Union from the common aims of mankind. You make practical policy today, not by our American interests, but by putting the common aims of mankind first. And of course, once you proceed with that, as you were talking about, John, before, once a certain idea takes root, that we've been had, there was a fraud perpetrated on us, we've been chumps, and you apprehend a higher conception, well, then, in a sense, the spell is broken. And what Mrs. LaRouche has been saying is absolutely, it is the case that we could have a summit of the heads of state of the US, China, Russia, and India. What's the first item? You need a World Health System. We've lost 640,000 Americans to COVID. China has lost 6,400. Isn't there a way that we can deal with this horrific crisis together in some fashion through dialogue? Next question, famine, lack of food, lack of energy. Couldn't this be discussed? Security interests. So it's interesting that over a year and a half ago, we put forward a proposal. Mrs. LaRouche put forward a proposal. Heads of state summit, U.S. president, China, Russia, India. The problems are so big, so universal. Get them together, like during World War II. You brought Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin together again and again and again. Who could imagine more disparate personalities and social systems? Churchill, the horrific British racist colonialist, FDR, the genius American descended from the circles of Alexander Hamilton, Stalin, essentially a peasant, leading a communist a giant. Yet, had that alliance not come together on principle, Japanese fascism, German fascism would not have been defeated. And of course, that could be done again today. But we're so brainwashed by the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN and whatnot. You say, oh, that'll never happen. Oh, that'll not happen. But baloney, it'll never happen. It can happen. And that's what this indication of a discussion coming from China, coming from the US State Department. Maybe we can work together on this ticking time bomb of a civil war in Afghanistan.
A civil war, or just the creation of a number of gangs, the huge tribal gangs. One of the tragedies of that area, of course, is the way the British drew national lines, and there's an ethnic group there called the Pashtuns,
Mm-hmm.
which straddles Pakistan and Afghanistan, which takes them out as players, kind of like the Kurds in a different part of Asia that don't have a country, and they therefore are easily drawn into things like the Taliban and movements. They're in the southern part of Afghanistan, and the northern part of Afghanistan, completely different people, different
Mm-hmm.
different traditions. But will those people have a place at the table when these discussions are done, or is it just going to be like great powers coming in and say, you take this and we'll take that?
From my understanding, the Taliban now controls about 85% of the geography of the nation. Their expansion grew tremendously after the U.S. invasion after 2001, which itself was a horrendous mistake. They are a popular movement and represent a popular force. And then you have the government of Afghanistan. So it absolutely is the case that many, at this meeting that took place in Uzbekistan this week of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, were the top representatives of India, China, Russia, the Central Asian nations. And what was discussed is that the solution has to be Afghanistan designed and Afghanistan run. And in fact, there are several forums in which the Taliban is meeting with international representatives. The Afghanistan government is meeting with representatives, and some type of coalition joint process has to proceed. But as Mr. LaRouche always emphasized over the decades, as soon as you begin talking about talking, when you begin to talk about negotiating, you have to have shovels in the ground, transforming horrendous poverty into modernity and potential for a decent life. There has to be economic development immediately going on, which is why I cite the statement of the Chinese and the US State Department. This map here shows one a Chinese copper mining interest towards the east, and the other an Indian iron ore mining interest. In fact, this map here was done by American engineers, by the US Geological Survey, and each of those colored boxes represents another huge store of valuable minerals underground. You could combine American engineers, Chinese engineers, the Afghanistan government, and the Taliban in beginning to employ the population in national reconstruction from nothing, from a disaster. Look at what happened in the rebuilding of Vietnam after the misguided, devastating Vietnam War. Look at what the US did in Europe. Europe was a rubble field after World War II. We had the Marshall Plan and a conception, and we had credit institutions with virtually unlimited credit to build. And within a decade and a half, Germany was once again the jewel of machine tool making in the world. This is natural. It's easy. It can be done, and it's the old time American methods. And if America would realize that China is having a rebirth from its great history of science, innovation, technology. Russia is a very advanced nation, which coherent interests with the U.S. These kinds of projects could be done, and perhaps the severity of the crisis can terrify certain forces enough to say, okay, we're not going down the road to a nuclear confrontation. There has to be an alternative, and that's what we've been pushing for. And you have intelligentsia in China, in Russia, and India who think in these terms, not in CNN terms, not in internet conspiracy theory terms. Yeah, there it is, the Silk Road.
It's the greatest threat to the British Empire that's ever been created. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. I mean, the British Empire was founded on the theories of Halford Mackinder and others in the 19th century. We all learned it in school. I remember my social studies teacher teaching it to me in 7th grade, that Eurasia, the landmass of Eurasia, was the heartland. And whoever controlled Eurasia controlled the world. And everything else, like the United States, Great Britain, this was the periphery. And the job of the periphery was to make sure that there was never a unified Eurasia, because then the money centers of London and New York would be out of business. This is British geopolitics. Always get the great powers of Asia one to fight the other. But now what's happening is something completely different has occurred, as Andy is showing on the screen. China and Russia are integrating their Belt and Road Initiative and Eurasian Economic Union. Russia, the most advanced builders of nuclear power plants, are now building 4 advanced power plants in China. They're integrating their economies. They're integrating their defenses. As your listeners know, Putin had announced they have the most advanced supersonic weapons of any nation in the world. They're prepared for anything. So the British Empire's nightmare of a growing, unified landmass of Eurasia, self-developing, that's the end of British offshore finance. That's the end of derivatives trade, and that's what these guys in London and Wall Street are afraid of. What's going to happen? It's an open book, which is why, as we've discussed, we urge your listeners, your followers, your supporters to become activists. Go to the schillerinstitute.com website, sign up, become a member, put in $25, put in $100, put in nothing, and just give us your name and email. Be part of a movement in the tradition of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and FDR.
I like this seminar titled "There is no climate." Was it? There's no climate
emergency.
There's no climate emergency. Yeah, I am so with that idea, and I am so glad that you're devoting a seminar to that, because, geez, it's like people have been. I, I always say, hey, I haven't seen the sea level rise. I can go out, walk across the street, go down to the water, and say, it doesn't look any different than when I was a kid, So tell me what happens now. Doesn't water seek its own level? And if the sea level was rising in Europe, wouldn't it be rising over here too? And by the way, who says it's rising anywhere? And if it's not rising, then how what happened to all the science that I learned when I was in eighth grade about entropy and all that stuff? Is that all gone now? It just makes me nuts to think that people have bought into this completely anti-logical, against any basic science you might have learned in school.
Let's look at Switzerland. If you look at the vote in Switzerland, in the big cities, where the media is and the big universities, they went with the climate change, limit CO2. In the vast rest of the countryside, where you have technology proud farmers and whatnot, the vast majority of the population went against it. So, in a certain sense, John, you have to be careful, I think, of not buying into the illusion that they control the minds of the population. They don't necessarily. Look, how did Trump get elected?
Exactly.
He ran by saying, we're going to end the endless wars. I'm not a professional politician, and we're going to clean out the swamp. And people went. It wasn't just a vote, it was a wildly enthusiastic vote. So, Lincoln was right. You can't fool all the people all of the time. Our job is to constantly be provoking the minds of the population to think. Think for yourself. Don't accept what you're being told. Think of the consequences and think of the world as a whole. I mean, when Roosevelt in 1941 gave his four freedom speech, freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, he was saying that that's the right not of Americans, that's the right of every child in Mali, in Bangladesh, in Costa Rica. It was a speech about the human race. And America, when she knows who she is always a beacon of hope and a temple of liberty, not for Americans, for all mankind. And that's who we are. And that understanding, that memory, that remembrance can be activated. And that's what you and I, John, are so enthusiastic about, that people don't want to be fooled. And if we keep preaching, we'll recruit more preachers.
We also, I think, have a debt as a nation for the things that have been done in our name, to the people and the survivors of these holocausts and these genocides all around the world.
I
Not
agree.
Europe, but as I've been reading, South America, and of course the native Indian peoples in the United States, and how the Wall Street attitude, and I hate to call it, but it is the Wall Street attitude is completely lacking in any moral senses as regards humanity. It is a absolute um, cutthroat, devastating form of financing that has developed in this country. Perhaps it's our greatest flaw right now, that our governments, who have created the fertile field for capital to grow, as you said at the top of our show, uh, that's where credit legitimately comes from, is from the law allowing there to be this credit. And the best way to do it, as your folks have always emphasized, is to do it that the government is granting the credit, and not put that in the hands of a private bank or the Federal Reserve, which is just an amalgamation of these elite banksters. That that has got to stop. But in order to keep the popular will in charge, through its representatives, through representative Republican government, we have to stop letting corporations have permanent existence and have the rights of individual humans. That developed in the 1900s. I mean, the 1800s, the 19th century, especially under Vanderbilt and all of those tycoons that were able to develop a system wherein there's no longer any personal responsibility. Nobody's saying, "Hey, this is my corporation and I stand behind it." That was the way the corporations should have been, and they should have had limited terms, so that if you have a public project and you're going to build a rocket, or you're going to build a space program, or a Hoover Dam, or whatever you're going to build, then when it's built, then shut the corporation down, pay off the investors, and do something different. Because if you leave it there, then what we have now is what you end up with, is a bunch of worthless paper getting traded back and forth and used for money laundering by dark money deals from the drug industry and otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely the case that there is a certain political ferment which is growing, and we have to educate it, which is why programs such as yours is so important. Again, back to the Midwest, the American family farms are being absolutely devastated in favor of these vast, internationally corporate-owned conglomerates. And the multinationals, there may be a half dozen of them, not more, are killing the family farmer. Well, there is a resistance and an uprising going on in the Midwest that the food cartels, AGM, Cargill, Bunge, have to be broken up. That the laws which are on the books to break up the monopolies are not being enforced. What you need is a political organization, a political uprising, which holds representatives to account, that the laws be used, and let's say, in this instance, the food cartels be busted up. It can be done. People have to get active and realize that there is something afoot globally. I mean, what China has done in the last 40 years is absolutely spectacular. Uh, uh, Russia is turning back to its scientific traditions and doing all kinds of frontier work. There's an uprising going on in Africa. That's that freedom to develop, that freedom, the right to progress, has a certain currency again across the globe, and America needs to be once again a standard bearer of that. And it starts with the individual and their local organizations. The kind of issues that you bring forward in your shows, people have to take them to heart and then act on them. Not listen, not gossip, not talk, but act. And if you want to figure out how to act, well, come to organizations like our own. You'll see the kind of action that's being taken by otherwise active academic scientists. Many of the scientists who will be speaking at our conference a week from Saturday, "There is no climate emergency, apply the science and economics of development," made the decision that it wasn't enough to be a good scientist. You had to be an active patriot and a world citizen and make things happen. And there's a difference. So in a certain sense, I think a lot of your listeners may be inspired by the speakers, very internationally prestigious speakers who will be speaking on the 24th, who made a jump from being critics and complainers, although as experts, to creating political organization to make things happen. And that's what this group, Clintel, they have by now, I think, 1,000 signatures of physicists, scientists, PhDs, who are saying all this emission stuff is a lot of crap. It's a lie. It's computer hocus pocus. And it's another word for genocide, population control, depopulation, no more sophisticated than the lies of Thomas Malthus and Adam Smith. And that is happening. So once people realize, really, that's going on, Well, that's really happening. I mean, it's possible. Yes, 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 yes. And it's good that now you're bothering yourself to find out about it. Okay, let's go. Okay, here's the plan. Here are your orders. Come back in a week. Tell me how it went.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Activism has been out of style for a long time, and it's time to bring it back. Citizenship requires, e- eternal vigilance, as the saying goes.
Mm.
The price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and we all have to be vigilant, and we all are being lulled to sleep. From my youth watching '50s television, and to whatever is going on in the minds of our young people today. They are pushing a bunch of uh, narratives and nonsense at us to try to get us disengaged and to get us to not pay attention and not feel like we have a stake or a voice. And that's uh, one of the most wonderful things that I've learned about your organization is that you are active. You're out there doing it, and bravo. And I urge everyone to participate in this conference, and I urge everyone to support the Schiller Institute. Um, let's just cover one more thing since we've got a couple more minutes, and
Great.
this is brought up by Andy. Andy, you want to put that slide back up again with the other Gates that we often talk about, that being Bill Gates, um, and uh, America's top farmland owners. Number one, Bill and Melinda Gates, 242,000 acres. And
Mm.
apropos of your comments that the farmers are rising up, my question is, what farmers? Do we still have enough of the family farm tradition out there to raise enough enough attention to get something done? And more broadly, how has this happened? How is it that America, built on the family farm, has now become a province of the empire of Bill Gates?
One of the problems that developed in the post World War II period is the cult of free trade. Now, free trade is famously used by the British, where they wanted to force the American colonies to accept all kinds of processed goods at high prices, and the American colonists were forbidden from doing their own manufacturing. Another example of free trade is in the 1830s and 40s, as I mentioned before, the British East India Company navies uh, said to the Chinese, "You must buy opium." And when the Chinese refused, uh, they invaded and seized parts of China and murdered and pillaged and raped. Well, another form of free trade is the taking apart of the parity system in agriculture in the United States. And this was a system that functioned from the period of Roosevelt through after the war, where the government guaranteed, let's say the dairy farmer, a certain price, fair price, for 100 pounds of milk, and the government would set a parity price, and the processor and the dealer had to pay that price to the farmer, calculated by the government, so that the farmer could maintain production as is with a certain margin of profit for expansion. And that was government controlled, like your driver's license. You're a rough, tough guy and you don't like anybody telling you what to do. I'm not going to get a driver's license. I'm just going to drive around anywhere I want. Well, you do that, pretty soon you're going to end up in jail with no license and can't drive. The government role is critical in areas of the economy which are life sustaining, such as the availability of electricity, the availability of food. And the cult out of Yale and University of Chicago and Harvard of free trade, saying that government is bad, government can't interfere with the markets. Baloney. The government's responsibility is to protect the general welfare. That's in the Constitution. And what happened was a lot of organizations like the Farm Bureau, mass organizations, and others got fooled. They got snookered. They got taken. And the parity pricing, which guaranteed the prosperity of the farmer who had 100 cows or 200 cows or a small grain producer, they were guaranteed by the government a fair return on their sweat. And when that was taken apart, when parity pricing was taken apart, the bankruptcies started to soar, land was bought up, and you have industrial farming. So there was a certain British ideology of free trade, from the oppression of the American colonists to the genocide against the Chinese, which made a British resurgence in the United States around the cult of free trade, anti-government. No, if you want to get to the moon, the government is involved. If you want to educate a population to be literate and creative, you have the government running the school system, etc. Same thing with agriculture. And when that system was taken apart, it was the beginning of the crisis that we have in spades today.
Fantastic. That was a very comprehensive and understandable answer delivered in less than 2 minutes. And our last minute devoted to thanks once again to you, Richard Black, and the Schiller Institute. Thanks to Andy Dybala and Neighborhood News Hour. And
Yes, thank you, Andy.
thank you, Andy. Thank you, Aaron, and everyone else. Thanks, George Webb, and all the great Ospreys and researchers out there that are doing such a great job to bring down this Green New Deal. I say no Green Deal. All right. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you for having me anytime. My great pleasure.
All right. Good night, everyone.